Welcome back to part two of Hannah and I discussing the carnivore diet. So, in this part, we are going to go over the evidence backing or not backing the carnivore diet, and then the practical takeaways like, is it worth it to abandon all produce and go full carnivore?
Yeah. And can maybe we touch on is all plant food bad for you? I know that's not the scope of this episode, and we'll have another one on lectins and, anti-nutrients and all of that, but
Mm-hmm.
it's
I think we
relevant.
should definitely touch on that. Yes, I I would love that.
Awesome. Let's
That's
do it.
that is something I'm very passionate about. Okay, so the evidence for the carnivore diet is limited, to say the least, from the scientific research side of things. So when you go on PubMed and search for carnivore diet, you get 21 results, which is a very small amount of studies, period, but only six are really well, not even really, only six are somewhat applicable to this conversation. Some of the results that you get when you put in carnivore diet are like the carnivorous tendencies of zebrafish, which has nothing to do with our
Oh,
conversation.
yeah.
So when you limit it to human studies, or I mean, I just limited it to any study that was examining the carnivore diet as we're talking about it, in this episode. We only get six results. So the main study that people talk about is actually a study. It's called Behavioral Characteristics and Self-Reported Health Status Among 2,029 Adults Consuming a Carnivore Diet. This is the primary study that is usually spoken about if the person talking about the carnivore diet even brings up a study, which is somewhat rare. And I think it's just because this hasn't been studied. I think this is important to speak to. Like, people will often fall back on like their own biases to explain why something has been studied or not. It is true that there has to be enough money to perform a study. There has to be, like academic interest. For whatever reason, we don't know exactly why. People have not studied the carnivore diet much. And this study is actually a study done as a survey of people eating the carnivore diet on social media. So it's something. It's
Mhm.
not the strongest study design. There is no control. There's no actual experiment, right? This is just a study, and then they're reporting their findings. So the study was set up that the researchers went on to social media. This was like between March and June of 2020. And they asked these adults that self identified as eating a carnivore diet for over 6 months for some information. 67% were male. So there were a good amount of females in this report, which I think is actually a strength of this study. And so these people reported eating carnivore diet for 14 months, primarily for health reasons. And I think that that's an important point to make, is that people are, I mean, 93% of the people in this study at least reported eating it because they had something going on that they were trying to change with their health. So I think that's
Mhm.
just important to keep in mind. There were not many side effects of the carnivore diet. And Hannah, this might be a good place for us to kind of talk about the hypothetical GI effects of
Mhm.
cutting out all plant foods. So, not many side effects, period. GI related side effects, gastrointestinal, were still the highest at 3 to 5%. And actually, before we started recording, Hannah and I were just looking at some research on how an all animal food diet might affect the gut.
Mhm.
So, this comes up.
Yeah. It's definitely something to keep in mind. I mean, that is my main concern when someone says they're doing a carnivore diet or they are interested in doing that is it is going to affect your gut. We know that. And we can talk about this more in just a minute, but we know that a high protein diet changes your gut balance and it
Mhm.
potentially could be pretty bad for the gut, but
Yeah,
it
the
might depend on the
yeah,
person.
yeah, yeah,
And so
yeah.
it's just something to be aware of. And it's one reason I would never do a carnivore diet because I'm pretty aware of what it would do to my gut and it wouldn't be great. So,
Yeah, I think you and I both were probably very touched by the teachings of Jason Harlock.
yes.
Like, so, and this is actually a great resource, I think, for listeners. what is his website? Probioticadvisor.com.
.com. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Jason Harlack. Okay, this is a weird connection, Hannah. I don't know if I've ever told you this. So I used to work at an herbal apothecary in Northern California.
Mm-hmm.
It's still there on Commercial Street in Nevada City. Jawway Graf owns it now. It's gorgeous. If anybody's in Northern California, it's totally worth it to go to Nevada City to go to her herbal apothecary. So this woman that I worked there with, I told her that I was going into the graduate program at UWS, and she was like, "Oh, this guy that I went to naturopathic school is teaching the gastrointestinal course there." And that was Jason Harlack. And so even before I started the program, she just had wonderful things to say about him. And sure enough, he and his wife both, I really respect their work. Yeah. And he admittedly, right, is like his bias is to promote a very robust, healthy GI environment. That is like what he goes towards more than anything. And I remember being in class with him and, looking at the evidence and then continuing to study. And I know you've studied this a lot after that. Taking out plant foods based on what we know does not do any favors for that environment.
Right. And that is a little bit of my bias too, because I'm heavily influenced by him and what I've researched. And that's what I try to educate people on and help is promoting a diverse, robust microbiome through a variety of plant foods.
Yeah.
And so carnivore kind of is just like, nope.
Yeah.
But what does that mean for people who feel great on it? I don't know.
I know. And we're going to talk about that. And then I think that we haven't touched on this much, but there's kind of carnivore is a spectrum.
Yes.
That should be like the name of the episode is carnivore is a spectrum. It's like, I think some people they're eating the lion diet and it's just meat and salt and water. And then some people are eating like kefir and fruit and maybe sweet potatoes even.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like kind of different.
Yeah. And so those are all going to do different things.
Yeah. There's a quote. Meredith Kinzel-Zeider used to say this when we would teach together. She was like, you have to feed yourself and then you have to feed your gut bugs. And I've never forgotten that, and it's like in this diet, it comes up for me too. I'm like, gosh, what is happening to those gut bugs?
Yeah.
So
we don't know because it hasn't been, there's not a study where it's looking specifically at someone's baseline gut bacteria and then doing carnivore for 6 months and like measuring that and seeing what's happening and recording their quality of life, their side effects, maybe inflammatory markers, maybe like endotoxins in their bloodstream that have come into there from the, breakdown of their gut ecosystem. I mean, so we don't know.
Yeah.
But I think it's worthwhile to keep in mind because it could potentially be a really bad side effect. And the same, I think it's been studied a little more in ketogenic diet, where they have done that type of study where they keep an eye on people who are eating very low carb for an extended period of time, keep an eye on their gut, what's going on, and they lose a lot of diversity. They do have shifts. It can be kind of a harmful side effect. And GI side effects are part of ketogenic diet, but it depends on, some people use that type of diet for therapeutic reasons. They really need it for whatever, for cancer, for epilepsy, for autism. And so it's kind of like you weigh your benefits, and it can be fixed by increasing fiber that's not high in carbohydrate. So like taking a high, fiber supplement like PHGG, partially hydrolyzed guar gum, or maybe eating lots of fibrous low carb veggies that can fix it. And I would say the same for carnivore, except for all the big influencers with carnivore say you shouldn't eat any plant foods. So that's very confusing for the people trying to follow this advice.
Or even, it's like when you look at like you are not look, but if you just hear the words like partially hydrolyzed guar gum, you're like, guar, like, aren't you supposed to avoid like thickeners? And it's like, no, this is a completely different compound. That's this like pure. I love PhD. I have like a place in my heart for PhDG.
And it tastes so good. I love it. I love the way it tastes.
And as we're talking about this, I'm like, we have to send an email to Dr. Harlack and I'm like, can I mop your floors, please? And you come on the podcast.
Oh God, that would be amazing.
So, I mean,
Um,
just as like a reflection of this, even though side effects were low in this study, the people who did experience side effects, most of them were GI related. It's just
Mhm.
something to keep in mind. Like,
Yeah.
especially when we talk about the takeaway, like, is it worth it? We're not sure. So, the other thing to keep in mind in this study, people reported their blood lipids, which is, I don't think if I've ever seen that in another study. Usually biometrics are taken by the researchers. People don't just report what their LDL cholesterol or their total cholesterol was. In this study, though, that was the case. They reported it. And LDL cholesterol was elevated enough where the researchers say it was markedly elevated. So 172 milligrams per deciliter. HDL and triglycerides were within a good range, like mid range. Like just thinking in my mind, that's a whole other conversation, like ranges on blood tests. But for this study, those markers were fine. This is a huge plus. Participants with diabetes reported benefits, including reductions in median BMI, glycated hemoglobin, so HbA1c, which is it's like the marker for
Mhm.
diabetes. And then diabetes medication use decreased. Big deals.
Yeah, that's all good. I mean, the
Very good.
LDL is concerning. You want, like, why is their LDL going up? I also think it's interesting that, like you mentioned, usually self-reported studies are not including like markers you would get
Yeah.
from going to the doctor and getting your blood work done. And I wonder if the people in this study happen to have that, because you mentioned these are all people who had some kind of health thing going on. They're trying to fix it. So they're trying carnivore. So perhaps they're routinely getting a blood panel done every 6 months or something. And so they have those in their web portal for their doctor ready to go, and they can just upload it
Hmm.
into their their data that they're sending in.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great point. I wonder if like if they just wrote down what they thought their LDL
Right.
was and they're,
Well,
it's like,
so also that, and the same thing with this type of study, which is important because you mentioned like this is like the study that's usually referenced when someone's
mhm.
talking about the benefits of carnivore. And like, let's remember, this is a self-reported collection of evidence. So like all the people are recalling what they ate. They're saying, yes, I did this for this long. This is my cholesterol panel. Maybe that's their memory. Maybe it isn't. Maybe I'm guessing. There's no really way to know. And so
Yeah,
the it kind of its evidence is kind of weak, I guess. It's
it
like really
is.
interesting.
Yeah.
It's a great jumping off point to be like, we should do more studies on this. But having this as your fallback study that you're basing everything off of isn't really
It's not good.
good.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
weak. You nailed it with that. It's weak. And I will say this. So in the study, the researchers were very aware of the limitations. They report that very
Mhm.
clearly. That's usually not brought up when you're like, the people eating carnivore had to reduce their diabetes medication. You're not like, and here are some limitations that the authors reported. But that is the case. They reported those. Um, the authors. So two of the authors for sure are very involved in doing work on low carbohydrate diets. Um, we're going to link to this study so you can, dig into this and check this out more. The main author, Dr. David Ludwig, that I looked into, um, he's reporting in this study that he gets royalties for books that recommend a carbohydrate modified diet. And he is very active on X, on Twitter, um, talking about his research essentially and what really seems to be his strong bias towards the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. So this is just one idea around why obesity or insulin resistance or metabolic dysfunction might be happening, where obesity is caused first by excess consumption of carbohydrates, and then that disrupts the normal metabolism, so normal insulin metabolism leading to weight gain. Um, this is kind of like, I guess when I think about this model, it's like where a lot of people sort of they like learned about metabolic dysfunction in relationship to diet was through this model. So they think carbs bad, carbs equal insulin resistance, insulin
Mhm.
bad, insulin equals fat, it's like they put these like big suppositions together in their mind. And then they don't realize that there are other models of metabolic dysfunction. And
Mhm.
he gets spanked pretty hard on X. I will say, when you go and you look at his Twitter feed, it's like he's pretty married to this idea. And people are like, dude, there's not that this model is wrong, but that there's more information that we have. So,
That's super interesting. You know, the carb, I feel like a lot of people listening, maybe, and myself too, that's like what you grow up on. You're like, this is
yeah.
how it works. This is what's happening. And then all of these diets like carnivore or low carb or keto are like the solution because it's like, well, duh, obviously, if you just want to fix your metabolism, you just cut these carbs down because that's what's causing all this dysfunction and it's a simple fix.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, learning that there were other theories and models around insulin resistance and metabolic
Yeah.
dysfunction, I was like, what? This
Yeah.
is mind blowing. That would be a great episode.
I
Just
know.
think about it.
We have
Because
some
there's some
friends that
cool,
are really excellent metabolic researchers that we'll send
maybe
some
we can talk about that
emails.
on when we talk about CGMs a little bit, because
Yeah. That would
that's
be
another
great.
thing. Wearing the glucose monitor, the whole like I feel like trend of that is the same model where you're like, we have to watch, don't let your blood sugar spike. It's gonna
Mhm.
do all the stuff to you. That said, like, I think obviously carbs, I mean, the type of carb matters, right? And so,
I
yeah,
think to an
there's
extent, it's like my husband has he has a lot of funny sayings about like diet and weight and muscle building and like that. And he's like, somebody forgot to tell the bodybuilders that insulin makes you fat. It's like those guys supplement with insulin for better or worse. I think resistance is the part where things can get really
right.
funky. And then if they do stop bodybuilding, if they stop that signaling process to tell their body to create, muscle and to use that fuel in a certain way,
Mhm.
that can be, I'm guessing, problematic. I've not looked at studies looking at like ex bodybuilders' insulin
Yeah.
sensitivity and resistance, but insulin is just a hormone that is a metabolically associated hormone primarily, not even solely, but primarily. But yeah, we've gotten into this loop that we think carb bad and sometimes any carb bad, insulin bad, that, because it makes us fat. But yeah, in another
Right.
episode, we can introduce there's really many more logical ways of looking at this. And even in this model, this pattern that we've seen where it's like there's this like grain of truth that kind of then gets surrounded by a lot of rhetoric happened with this model also. Okay, so in this study, just a couple other points I want to point out. This blew my mind. The authors talk about that altered lipid profiles, like the high LDL cholesterol, could be an issue for people, but they say that for people with more extreme LDL, that they could consider medication. And I was just like, what? There's so many excellent pieces of evidence, good research that shows, that we can affect our LDL cholesterol with dietary changes, but mainly with plant foods. So, and they even say that in the study, just kind of in a different context, that plant compounds do have proven benefits, but that possibly why people are seeing such a benefit from eating this diet is that maybe some people do have reaction to plant foods, whether it's a true allergy, some type of sensitivity,
Hmm.
the anti-nutrients, maybe some people are sensitive to those. So they state some interesting hypothesis about why people feel better on a carnivore diet. Again, we see this calcium deficiency come up again, might be a problem. And like I said, they did a great job of stating their limitations. So, totally weak study design. I mean, it's a survey. In a way, it's almost like we can see some pros and cons that maybe we weren't aware of, but we know that by and large, based on what we see on social media, on forums, we're going to talk about that in a minute, people are having wonderful benefits, some of
Hmm.
them. So this study just formalized that. Anything else you want to say about that study, Hannah?
I I'm like very curious about the LDL thing because as we know, cholesterol is very complex and it's not just like good and bad, but in general, LDL is kind of considered the quote unquote bad cholesterol.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because LDL is the lipoprotein that's carrying the cholesterol out from your liver throughout your body to do its job. And so that can kind of signify sometimes like maybe you have inflammation or something that needs healing, something's going on. Like, for instance, someone recovering from like surgery or something like that, well, their cholesterol panel will be changed. Like the LDL might
Mm-hmm.
be higher while your body is like healing and then it'll go back to normal. And so if these people, their LDL is like going up with carnivore, like I just have to wonder if it's not necessarily having to do with the cholesterol from the plant foods, because isn't um, the cholesterol in your diet a small component of what will show up on your blood work? I mean, I know it can alter it, but even if you were eating a low cholesterol diet, your body's still making cholesterol. You could still potentially have high LDL even if you aren't eating, if you were totally vegan or something like that, right? So I wonder how much of that is like them adjusting to eating higher cholesterol, and how much is it a sign that maybe some inflammatory processes going on and it's messing with their cholesterol numbers from
Mm-hmm.
taking out plants and only eating animal, products. I
Yeah,
don't know.
that cholesterol, like lipid research and lipid physiology,
Hmm.
I'm like,
It's
oh,
complex,
yeah,
man.
I want to like read about that more before I
Yeah.
even start to like get my toes wet in
Yeah.
that pond.
Same.
But
Same.
yeah, I mean, the basic physiology that you laid out is, based on my knowledge, absolutely correct. It's like LDL takes the cholesterol into the body. And just for people to understand, cholesterol is it a heavy molecular weight alcohol? Hang on. I'm going to Google this.
Yes, I think the chemical, the way the makeup, the design of it is more similar to an alcohol than a fat. I'm pretty sure.
Principles, it's a sterol
Okay.
distributed in body tissues, and it's in animal fats and oils. Um, yeah, so it's an essential structural compound of animal cell membranes. I mean, this is a very different conversation. Like I said, I don't feel super,
Yeah.
like I'm like,
All I was where I was
but
going with that is like it's something to like be aware of, think like why was that happening? Like what is it doing
yeah,
to their
what is the
bodies?
reason?
What is it doing maybe to their gut microbiome, because your gut affects the recycling of cholesterol. And
Yes.
that's one reason why if you have high cholesterol, your doctor might tell you to start eating psyllium husks or flax seeds,
Or
because that
oatmeal.
helps bind to the cholesterol in your gut and you excrete it instead of recycling it, and it helps lower it. And so like
Mm-hmm.
removing all dietary fiber, maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's why it's high. Or maybe it's because you have dysbiosis now and it's affecting inflammation in your body. And so your cholesterol is increasing. Like there's so many
Yeah.
reasons. It's just like very interesting to me to see that. And I've seen that
Yeah.
on forums, like people who go carnivore, they feel great, but then they go to the doctor and get their blood work, and their doctor's like, holy crap, your cholesterol is like really
Hi.
high
Yeah.
and not in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're in the forum like, guys, what do I do? Like, what's going
Mm-hmm.
on? How do I fix this? Well, the easy fix is probably to add plant foods back, ones that you tolerate and aren't sensitive to, or supplement accordingly with fiber. But
Yeah.
it's hard because, like you said, a lot of times people who do this, they need something to heal them, and
Right.
they're under the idea that this is the healing diet, and then your doctor's like, no, this is bad for you, and so it's like this very conflicting thing,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
And then you hear someone on Instagram, rattle off like 15 terrible sounding chemicals that are in like broccoli and kale and cauliflower. And you're like, oh my God, everything in the produce aisle is poison. I can't eat any of that. We're going to touch on that. Yeah. I mean, I do think that there is a connection between the cholesterol that we eat and our LDL increasing, but I just might be wrong about that. So that's why I'm like, oh, I don't know. We'll come back to
Yeah,
that.
we'll come
God,
back.
let's call in somebody for an episode on cholesterol. Holy, we're going to get canceled if we do an episode on that. Um, There are a couple other studies. There's one written by, it's a review article, this author, L. Amber O'Hearn. Can a carnivore diet provide all essential nutrients? Current opinion in endocrinology, diabetes, and obesity is where it was published. So she writes up what she's found about the carnivore diet. I did a little bit of digging into who she is. She is on X as at Keto Carnivore. Her tagline is eat meat, not too little, mostly fat. She has an obvious pro bias toward the carnivore diet. I mean, I will tell you, when we teach students how to write and how to research, we encourage that they include pro, con, neutral, all viewpoints in a review paper that they'll write and submit. That was here a little bit. She reported that calcium might be a possible deficiency, likely due to the acid load of the diet. But her background is not in nutrition science. Jesus, something I think to myself is, even if your background is in nutrition science, for instance, like us having this conversation, in order to become an expert, you have to spend so much time just in like one little, like corner of the nutrition world. It's like not having any context of that, it's going to just introduce so many more variables that are hard to suss out, when she already has this bias. So, but we're going to link to that paper. I think it's just interesting that it's published. Again, it's like moving us in a direction of like, let's start to talk about this in a more controlled way. That is one great thing that, science can offer us in research literature. There was an editorial speaking to the social media survey. We're going to link to that. Limitations of self-reported health status and metabolic markers among adults consuming a carnivore diet. They basically stated every limitation that the authors of that paper stated themselves, but they were positive. They congratulated the authors on taking the first step towards quantifying the health effects of the carnivore diet. So that was cool. That is about it on the science side of things. But we're not just going to look at that. Ancestrally and anecdotally, there is experience and proof also that we want to discuss. So it is true that some traditional people ate close to an exclusive meat and fat diet, but I think it's really important to point out that that is what was available to them.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I think that, you're right. It was available to them depending on where they live. Like Inuit peoples, because it's cold, there's not going to be as many plants growing except, the early spring, early summer, and
right.
So that's what they're eating. Other, indigenous people in the United States, some of them probably ate more plant foods and some of them probably ate more animal foods. And it probably just depended. I feel like using that as like the basis for the whole argument around why we have to eat carnivore is really just riddled with, it's just not, it's not good. It's not a good way to back it up because it was a different time.
Mm-hmm.
Your lifestyle is completely different. And I wonder, I'm just like rambling right now. Sorry, my brain.
Well, there's like a million things that go through my head also when I hear this. So
I always do think about like your genetics. So
mm-hmm.
if you are someone who your ancestors were Inuit and you are Inuit, maybe you are predisposed and you're going to handle a high fat, high protein diet a lot better than someone from, Northern Europe. That's where their ancestry is from.
Yeah.
And so I think about that too. Like when we're like, we have to all eat this way. It's like, well, do we? Because like maybe you're not even supposed to, and I think it's really interesting. And I think that also it kind of tends to exclude the amount of plant food that was in ancestral diets, because we do have evidence showing us that indigenous people and our ancestors actually did eat a lot of plant foods and a pretty wide variety of them.
Yes.
And that's not talked about as much. And it's not talked about because it's not as interesting to say, well, they just ate a balanced diet, what was available to them.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to sell as hard as something really extreme. And I think it's unfortunate that that's left out of the conversation a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean, there is tons of evidence that we ate whatever we could eat.
Right. Exactly.
Were
You
there
just want to stay
ants?
alive
We
and
ate
have
them.
enough
Yeah,
calories. And so you're going to eat anything. I mean,
anything. There's actually a hypothesis called the grandmother hypothesis. Have you heard this? For,
no.
human females are one of like just a handful of mammals that live past reproductive age. Most mammals die, male and female, after their reproductive years are done because, from an evolutionary standpoint, I'm not saying from like a spiritual standpoint or a life fulfilling standpoint, but just pure evolution. What we're here for is to create survivable progeny. That's it. Kids that live. That is what evolution needs for our species to continue. So it's totally illogical for human females to continue to live after they can reproduce, but we do for like a long time. I mean, what is the average lifespan of a woman now? Like late 70s, I want to say.
Mhm.
Well, we stopped reproducing at 50. So whatever, that's like 25 at least years. That's bananas in evolutionary terms. But they think that the reason that we evolved that way is because the grandmothers knew where the stashes were so that we could like help take care of the kids for sure, but like lead the people to like the best little food plots. Like we knew where stuff was.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting.
Yeah, it's a hypothesis. It's a grandmother
Yeah.
hypothesis. So it's like it sort of hinges. I don't want to say totally. It's like I think women killed animals and ate them, and that was totally
Mhm.
part of it. But it does relate to there's this one really fantastic researcher, field researcher that we found, Catherine Milton. She wrote this editorial for the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2000. And also she just looks rad. Like when I found her, I was like, oh, I want to like go study with this woman. Um, so in her editorial, there was this great quote: "The hunter-gatherer data used by Cordain, which is like some of the most widely cited nutritional data of ancestral peoples. It came from the Ethnographic Atlas, a cross-cultural index compiled largely from 20th century sources and written by ethnographers or others with disparate backgrounds, rarely interested in diet per se or trained in dietary collection techniques, which is a specific form of ethnography, of anthropological reporting. By the 20th century, most hunter-gatherers had vanished. Many of those who remained had been displaced to marginal environments. Some societies coded as hunter gatherers in the Atlas probably were not exclusively hunter gatherers or were displaced agricultural peoples. Because most of the ethnographers were male, they often did not associate with women who typically collect and process plant resources."
Mm.
So, I mean, she goes on to state some other points about why our ancestral nutrition data might be inaccurate, but I just thought that was really interesting. I mean, we also have evidence from like patterns on people's teeth that were found. The like plaque even collection can be taken off of teeth that and skeletons that are found. So, and then there's just it's like we had to feed this big old brain that we evolved with. We needed calories.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, your brain uses so much of your daily calorie intake. I mean, you need glucose for your brain. A lot of
Big
it.
time. Yeah, big time.
Yeah.
So the ancestral argument, yeah, we definitely ate meat, but we ate anything we could get our, huge brained hands on. We also have some information that's we had to feed the brain, right? That's like I actually love evolutionary biology.
Mhm.
Someday, Hannah, if this podcast takes off, I'm going to get my PhD. But it's like every account. It's like you just that we had to get calories from somewhere. We think about calories now as this specific thing. We get to
Mhm.
choose our calories. We didn't get to choose calories, but it's like, yeah, a balanced diet was just whatever you could get. So
Yes.
I think we forget that when we go to the grocery store. Um, there's also evidence that we'll link to that shows our ancestors' diet was very alkaline forming. So this kind of brings in that acid base balance, the net acid load, that may be a concern eating an all animal food diet is that those foods are more acid forming in the body versus plant foods, which are more alkaline forming. This is a big conversation in the nutrition world, a little bit controversial. I would say that controversy is starting to die down a little bit because we have more and more evidence showing that diet can affect the pH of the blood. Yeah, and we have a study estimation of the net acid load of the diet of ancestral peoples that we'll link to, and it was highly alkaline forming, which means plants. So people are eating plants.
Yes. In contrast to the modern diet, which is considered to be really acid forming.
Yeah.
So, and not just because of meat, because of, just crappy food in general.
Yeah. Processed grains.
Yeah. Processed grains, just excessive salt. I don't think salt's bad for you, but you consume, some people consume a lot of it. And yeah, it's interesting. And like, this is similar to when I'm thinking about the gut microbiome. And that's my concern with carnivore is that our ancestors' microbiome, our hunter-gatherer microbiomes were much more diverse, based on the evidence we have. And that is because one of the reasons, because of the variety of plant foods, whatever they're eating, foraging, growing, like they're eating all of this different stuff. Of course, it has other things too, like they weren't taking antibiotics. They weren't exposed to, microbiome harming chemicals in their personal care products, and they're at literally everything we're exposed to now. So there's the stress, the type of stress was different. There's all kinds of things, but I think that's something to keep in mind. I mean, if we're going to make the argument that the reason to do carnivore is because it's what our ancestors ate and because of what these, vibrant hunter-gatherer populations ate, like that's not an argument. If we're going to base it on that, then we would say, okay, you eat both. You eat a variety of plants and you eat good quality meat. And
if we ate like our ancestors, do you remember that movie Encino Man? Did you ever watch that? I loved Pauly Shore. I'm like a huge lover of comedy, even Pauly Shore's comedy, which actually, just as a total side note, he's back in comedy and he's hilarious still. Anyway, Encino Man, Pauly Shore and his dumb buddy are in the backyard digging a pool by hand one summer, and they like come across this caveman that is like frozen solid in Southern California somehow. It's Brendan Fraser. He pops out. He's Encino Man. Anyway, he eats anything he can get his hands on. If you would eat like Encino Man, you would just start to eat whatever your eyes landed on. That is how people were eating. It's like, if you ever have seen accounts of when people find fruit, modern day hunter gatherers, or if people find honey, they just go ham. It's like, yes. Yeah.
You don't know when you're going to have another meal again. I mean,
or that carbohydrate source.
Right. Yeah. Cause you need those carbs for energy for your brain. And I think it's just so hard for us to even imagine that, because we are so removed from, any type of adversity like that. Like we're in, we just have so many options. We're so safe. We just can't imagine things that way. And it's
totally different world. Yeah. It's a completely different world. Also, Hannah, we're going to have to get you a copy of Encino Man. So that's a Brendan Fraser classic and Pauly Shore classic. Okay, here's some amazing pieces of the carnivore diet. People feel way better when they eat it. Some people feel like better than they've ever felt in their lives. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of testimonials saying this. One of the biggest forums is on the Lion Diet, which is Michaela Peterson. That's Jordan Peterson's daughter, on Facebook. There's 44,000 people on Facebook, 165,000 on YouTube. And it's like comment after comment after comment with like before and after pictures, testimonial, people being like, I couldn't get pregnant before, I can get pregnant now. I had diabetes, I don't have it anymore. I mean, just like every testimonial you can imagine, which I'm like, awesome. If you're a grown ass person and you want to try this diet and you feel better, that is great. That's my like, I'm your buddy hat. When I put on my like, what the hell is actually going on hat, I'm with you. I'm like, I would love to see a before and after of their microbiome we haven't even touched on this, but it's like even collecting microbiome samples is just flawed to hell. We just do the best that we can to get what bacteria we can and analyze what's there. I would love to see their inflammatory markers, acid-base balance, bone density, all of these things. But I am glad that these people feel better. And I think it's really important to pay attention to that. And it is kind of funny to me that like there's actually this example. Michaela Peterson posted this video on YouTube, which is a response to an article that an RD wrote for the Mayo Clinic about the carnivore / diet. I mean, look, Michaela is very like, this is the best thing for leaky gut. This is the best thing for, all these issues. There's a lot of caveat that's missing in her video and in her take, but I feel like there's also a lot of caveat that's missing in this Mayo Clinic article. We'll link to both of these. If there are thousands of people saying like, hey, something is working for me here, to me, it seems really worthwhile to enter in with an empathetic eye and a very like controlled eye and say, hey, let's check this out together. Not like you just can't do that. It's like, well, yeah, you can do it actually. And if the options that are being offered to you aren't working or completely inaccessible, which could get on a soapbox here real quick, because even in the middle of Boston, with some of the best insurance on planet Earth, because of my husband's job, he works for a venture capitalist firm, it's still hard to get treatment. So then it's like, okay, you go down a couple notches. It's like, can't even get in to see a doctor to get help. So you take matters into your own hands. It's like, yeah, you can do it. And maybe people feel like that's their only hope in some ways.
Right.
I'm like, yes, empowering. Yes. Again, it's strange to me that this has not been investigated in a more caveated way. All that to say, I think there can be some big problems with this. But I'm happy people feel better. So
yeah, I mean, it does work for people. It's pretty miraculous, like what you see. And I think there's lots of reasons why, like, what were they eating before? How sick were they? Meat, animal protein is a tremendous source of extremely valuable nutrients, micronutrients, protein, zinc, chromium, like all of these minerals. It doesn't have vitamin C or fiber.
Yeah.
But like it has all these other like important nutrients that most people do not get in their diet. Like
and did they lose weight? I think about that. Like,
yes. So they lose weight. So they're removing that source that creates other problems, metabolic problems, inflammation, things like that. And so to build muscle, I mean, building muscle is one of the most incredible things you can do for your metabolic health and for longevity.
Yes.
And so it's like, okay, well, yeah, I see why it's working. Like, this is awesome. Should you be doing it for the rest of your life?
Yeah.
I don't know. Like,
and could you get that effect if you did it with plants? Some plants, friends?
That's what I wonder. I mean, I guess that's technically what paleo is all about, right? Like, people have a similar thing, but it's, I don't know. I mean,
do you remember Sarah Ballantine used to have that hashtag more vegetables than a vegetarian?
No.
So Sarah Ballantine is the paleo mom.
Yes.
But she used to have that hashtag. I mean, yeah, I think it's interesting to... Oh, go ahead.
She has this whole thing right now where she's rebranding herself because she's no longer the paleo mom.
Oh, wow.
She has... I think you have to be a paid subscriber to get access to her new content. Basically saying I was wrong. Like,
good
she's
for
saying
you,
I was wrong about
yes.
this. I was wrong about this. All of these very militant paleo, key points.
I'm doing a happy dance right now.
Yeah, it's awesome. She's like, okay, I was biased. I was wrong. I now have read more research, and this is actually,
good for her.
Grains, I was wrong about seed oils. I was wrong about like all these different things.
Girl, let's ask her to come on the podcast. Would she ever, you think?
I don't know. She's big time.
She's big time. The ex-paleo mom.
Then we love what you're doing.
Yes. If you hear this.
Owning any mistakes. That's what we're all about.
Or just like, hey, I learned something new. Like,
exactly.
My guess is that our asses are going to get handed to us left and right on this podcast. And I can't wait because
Yes.
I'm like, you know about LDL cholesterol better than me. Great. Take me to school, sis. Let's hear it. Like I'm down for this. I'm going to get like an honorary podcast PhD just because I'm like, let's learn about this stuff. If we say
Yeah.
something stupid and you're an expert and you know better, please
Tell me.
email us
Yes.
and come on the show and let's all get better at this shit. That's the whole point. Nobody's ever going to get any better in their health unless we approach it like that. So good for Sarah Valentine, man. Cool. I'm glad I brought her up. Yeah. Okay. So this kind of, we come back to like, why is this working so well? And I think you said something that you said it in a much more accurate way than I did, which I think is really important because I'm just like, oh, maybe they lost weight. You don't just lose weight, isn't just this like amorphous, like it's not like a cloud floats off your body and then like you're
Yeah.
skinny. It's like weight is a thing that is it's you have a body that is made of fat and muscle and bone and connective tissue and your big old brain and whatever. So yeah, when we talk about weight loss, you said it really well. Muscle, people likely build muscle on this diet and maybe lose fat.
Right. And when you lose fat, things happen. You have toxins stored in your fat.
Yes.
You have fat is metabolically active and it produces inflammatory cytokines. And those are the hormones that trigger inflammation or anti-inflammation throughout your body. And so that's the thing with fat tissue is when you have high amounts of fat tissue, I mean, this has been studied, like you have more inflammation signals happening.
By and large, yes, that's
higher
true.
amounts of fat tissue affect your cellular health because of that. So it potentially could increase insulin resistance in your cells. I mean, I say potentially, I'm pretty sure that's pretty well understood. And so,
yep.
And then muscle does kind of the opposite. Muscle increases glucose uptake. Muscle increases the amount of calories you're using. Muscle, I mean, there's so many things. So it's like, if carnivore is doing that for people, then it's kind of like, well, duh, like, yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
You're gonna feel
and
really
then if
good.
you cut out these foods that you may be sensitive to or reactive to in some way, and then you have all of this going on at once, you're like, who cares about the microbiome? I feel awesome.
Exactly. And that's my thought too, is that like, okay, we do know that these high protein diets, the way your gut bacteria are metabolizing those amino acids creates these cytotoxic compounds and potentially carcinogenic compounds. But that's kind of like in a vacuum. Like we know that's happening. I want to know what's happening in those real people in real time.
Yeah.
Like, do they have dysbiosis from carnivore and does it matter for them?
Yeah. Oh, just to clarify, I do care about the microbiome. I know you also care about the microbiome. I'm saying somebody who's feeling so much better might just be like, who cares?
They don't even care.
Yeah, they don't think about it. Yeah.
And like, I wonder too, I guess that's kind of what I'm saying. Like maybe they are having these kind of drastic shifts, but if overall, like their inflammatory markers are good, their metabolic markers are good, and they feel good, which is the easiest way to like tell if something's working for you is like your self-reported like change in how you're feeling, your mood, your focus, your sleep, like all these things. Then does it matter that their microbiome is totally screwed? Maybe it doesn't even matter. I don't know.
There's one point that I think of just because I have such a strong family history of colon cancer. Like my grandmother was one of 6 kids and they all had colon cancer. Like just like the whole family.
Could be celiac disease.
Yeah. And I have celiac disease. Totally. She could have been celiac.
Yeah.
Which is so sad because I just have to share this personal anecdote. She was Italian, like came here from Italy, her family when they were young, and made the most delicious ravioli. And it's like my favorite food. And I just can't eat it. Like it just, destroys me. But yeah, celiac could have totally been, it's on my mom's side. I'm suspicious also. So it's like coming at me from both sides, but they all had colon cancer. No colon cancer in primary family, but polyps. So I think about people with that history and I'm like, we got to watch it. Like I'm very careful about my intake of processed meats. Like I can live on prosciutto and soprassetto and these like delicious cured meats, but we do have good evidence showing that like not meat specifically, but those like cured, salty
Compounds they're curing it with. That's what's bad.
that can be problematic. And then just generally with meat, I'm very careful to offset animal protein intake with lots and lots of fiber to keep my gut at the right pH. So maybe people who have that history, be very careful with this diet. That would be a caveat. And then just generally, like we've been talking about, is there a balance that could be struck? Like once you've used this as an elimination, do you just have to eat this for the rest of your life? And is it the best step, even as a primary step? Like I kind of think of as like an educated clinician, where would I go with someone versus going just straight to carnivore? I probably wouldn't use that as elimination. But just to kind of like round this out, I do think it's important for us to go there a little, to think like, why is this diet and working for people? What is happening? This kind of brings in the conversation about plant phytonutrients and reactivity to foods. There's not any direct evidence, but there is some indirect evidence that some very limited amount of people might have an imbalanced inflammatory reaction to these compounds that are in plants. 99.9% of people, right, just because of evolution, we grew up over hundreds of thousands of years with these plants, eat plants. This is what happens when you eat a plant. Just get ready for your mind to be blown. My mind was blown. So if you eat a plant, it stresses your body the hell out. People are like, oh, plants are good for you. Vegetables are good for you, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, actually they are poisonous. The influencers who talk about that, and like I said, go through this whole list of like, I can't even name one, hexacolonic biparodic acid, but whatever they say. It's like, yeah, those things are poisonous. Thank God they are, because what they do is they're gentle poisons. And poison is that term is very loose. They stimulate your body's own reaction, which is so powerful of an antioxidant that it's very beneficial. It's a form of stress that is very beneficial. Like exercise is a form of stress that's very beneficial. People think maybe the ketogenic diet is a form of stress that's very beneficial. The sun on your skin is a form of stress. It's like there's so many examples of this, technically called hormesis. So the problem with, being influenced to death, here we are again. God, we get a great name for our podcast. The problem is like people say just the first part of that story.
Right.
They don't follow it up with, and then your body responds in this hyper positive way, which is why we have just reams of evidence showing plants are anti-cancer, antioxidant, antiviral, and so good for, again, 99.9% of people. Could there be a subset of people who have an imbalanced inflammatory reaction? Yeah, for sure. There could be. We don't know for sure, but theoretically, like based on what we know from biochemistry, it could happen. Sure. But that's not the case. And it's definitely not a reason to go on Instagram or TikTok or wherever you post your videos and get into the produce aisle and hold up broccoli and be like, the sulforaphane in broccoli is stressful to X, Y, and Z. It's like you're leaving out the most important part of that. So,
oh man, that's when I get this is when I get mad. Like
I know, I get mad too.
People who have this, their career is built on this. They're educated, like Saladino, he went to medical school, and it's like, I know, dude, I know you know how to read a paper.
Yeah.
And I know you can see these other points. Yeah. And I know you can see this conclusion and this data, and you're just leaving it out because it's not selling your product. And it is such a disservice to all of these people who are loyal to you and who are looking to you for guidance, and you are doing them wrong for your own benefit. And man, that makes me so angry.
It grinds our gears.
It really grinds my gears. Yes. To keep it PG. I
Yeah.
it sucks. Like, why would you do that?
I don't
And
know. I mean, I would love to be charitable and like maybe he just doesn't understand redox science. Dude, when I
maybe,
started to learn about oxidation reduction science, I was like, I felt like I was having a stroke. I was like, this is the most phenomenal thing. Like, we live in these bodies that are so incredible that we can eat this thing, this plant that,
Mhm.
yeah, is slightly stressful. And then our response is so much more beneficial. We benefit. Incredible. It's incredible to learn about that.
It
So
is.
maybe he just doesn't know about that. For sure, the fact is that there's even many like nutritionists or clinicians that don't know about that. His audience doesn't know, you know?
Right.
So,
There's this really amazing herbalist in my town, and she has this fabulous Instagram account with all this really cool lessons in each of her videos. Her name's Leah Larabelle, and I went on an herb walk with her, and she found I don't know if this is just native to my area in Southeast Tennessee, but like this nettle that grows everywhere in my
mm,
yard, like everywhere around, and it's kind of this tall plant. It has these big leaves, and they have the thorns all over them, and it hurts. Like if you
yeah,
accidentally weed it out, it's like stinging your hand.
yeah,
And she was talking about how this plant, it doesn't have the same type of defensive chemicals in it like other plants do.
totally.
So
Cause it's spiky.
so what it did is it developed all these spikes to protect itself.
Love it.
And I was just like, yes, this is such a great illustration of that in real time. You can see it. And so she was saying, I mean, don't quote me on this. What I took from what she was saying is that like if you were stranded, you didn't have anything to eat and you found this plant, it's safe to just cut that really thick stem and
Mm-hmm.
take the nettle part away and eat the stem. It's like has lots of nutrients in there. You don't have to cook it. You can actually eat it raw. You don't have to cook it because it doesn't have high amounts of toxic compounds in it
Yeah.
because it has another method of self-defense. And I
It's
just thought that was so
amazing.
cool.
So it's not stinging nettle. It's some other type of
It's
nettle.
a different type of nettle. Yeah, I'm
Well,
pretty sure.
I mean,
There's several
even
different types.
with stinging nettle, it's like this is a whole other weird story that I could tell about my past. But you can take it. People take it. Urtication therapy is when they like tap
Yep.
themselves with the
Mhm.
nettle and it relieves all kinds of like arthritis symptoms. And my dear herbalist friend and I stripped down to our skivvies one day and rolled around in nettle until I was like, I feel altered. Like
Really? Now,
we shouldn't
does
have
it
dripped.
hurt initially?
It's like it's not. It doesn't sound like that plant. A
Yeah.
stinging nettle is just like ooh, like,
Yeah.
and you can kind of see there's little like you get a little irritated, but then we
Mhm.
basically just got so stoned we didn't care.
So it's doing that. It's like putting these little compounds in your skin that, yes, technically maybe it's poisonous. Um, it is,
You feel
you know,
amazing. You feel
but it's triggering all these pathways in your body to be like anti-inflammatory,
yes,
longevity,
big time
help,
endorphin
fix
release.
this, fix this,
Yeah.
endorphins. And that is why plants are good for you.
Yeah, and
You
it
know,
happens internally for us too,
Mhm.
which and yeah, we're going to get more into that as the podcast goes on. But yeah, it's like cutting out plants because their poison is like stopping exercise because it's stressful. It's like
Exactly.
exactly the same. No, you shouldn't just sit. You got to move around. Like we're so clear on that. And plants, it's a different biochemical mechanism, but they work in a very, very similar way in our body, as do many things. So yeah, that excuse doesn't hold water either. Um, should we move maybe to the takeaways? Like, should people
Yeah,
eat the
let's go.
carnivore
I feel
diet?
like yeah, I know what I'm about to say.
Yeah, what do you think, Hannah? Should people eat it?
I think if that is like your only option, you're like, I'm going to try this. If I was going to give some advice, I would say, hey, have you tried just not eating ultra processed food first?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I do with any elimination diet. Like in my courses, I tell people, like when talking about an elimination diet and how to do it, I'm like, before you do an elimination diet, take all ultra processed food out of your diet
Mm-hmm.
and see how you feel, because sometimes that's all you have to do. And you'll never know if you go
Mm-hmm.
from having a high ultra processed food diet straight to carnivore or some other extreme diet. you don't know like what it could have been. Like, do you actually have to be that restrictive? And so that would be my advice. First, do that. And then try, having higher amounts of meat and protein than you were eating before, because that probably is going to make you feel better. I can almost guarantee you,
Mm-hmm.
because it does so many good things for your body, but still eat plant foods
Mm-hmm.
and see how you feel. And you
Mm-hmm.
probably feel great.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you do have a severe sensitivity to some plant foods right now. I
Mm-hmm.
don't feel like that's like your forever.
Yeah.
You can probably heal from that and try to figure out if you can do that. But I do think if someone, like you said, has any kind of history of colon cancer or
Mm-hmm.
inflammatory bowel disease,
Kidney
be
disease.
kidney disease, I
Yeah.
would be hyper aware of doing something like this and probably say that's not a good idea for you. Like if I had a client come to me and they're like, I want to do carnivore, I would tell them all of those things that I
Yeah.
just said.
I'm
It
it's hard
doesn't
for me
have
to
to
even
be
think of
so
anything
extreme.
to no,
Yeah,
it
there's
doesn't.
no need for it to be extreme. Although I do acknowledge that in my years of working with clients, like so many people love that extreme diet. Like they just want it. Like they
Mhm.
come to you and they're like, just give me an extreme diet to follow. And like, I'm not going to do that. But people like it. And if that's what they want to do and it makes them happy, okay, you know?
Yeah. I'm like I don't think I have much more to add than that. It's like do exactly what you said. And I think
Hmm.
people, I know this is the case. They don't know what they eat until they start to write it down. It's like I know
Yes.
we've had enough clients where it's like, I mean, for sure, specifically your caloric intake or your macronutrient intake, but people eat unconsciously all the time. Not bad necessarily, but it's like you may think I'm eating, a very whole food diet or, few ultra processed foods. And then you start to write it down and you're like, oh shit, that's different.
Yeah.
Same with protein.
Everybody. Like when we were in grad school, we had to keep food logs. And even for people, I think it was like for meal planning or some class we took,
Mm-hmm.
even people who have studied this do the
Mm-hmm.
same thing. Like when I wrote my log down, I was like, oh God, I'm not eating any protein.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have very much variety.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I'm
And I was
someone who
like, how
know
many
better.
chocolate chicks am I eating a day? It's a lot
Yeah.
of chocolate chips. That's too many. I would like blame it on Andrew. And then actually in that class, I was like, that's me. Yeah. I mean, this is, I think, the main thing I think is if there is someone on social media selling you hard on a diet that is cutting out entire food groups, you might want to think about that. And
Mhm.
I don't mean that to be in a demeaning way at all. You all are going to understand as the episodes go on, like all of the crazy diets that I've tried. But long term, there are effects. And I think too, there's a little bit, I don't want to say this. I have no idea if this is true or not, but it's like when we're a little younger, it's like we don't think about the long term effects of things. Like I still crave cigarettes, right? I like loved smoking. And then not until I was in my 30s was I was like, oh shit, right? Like people get cancer and like I'm mortal. These things can happen to you. So there's some amount of that in here where I'm just like, God, like think in the future, this may have an effect on you that you
Mhm.
don't realize. For me, at least, that was the case more, when I was younger. And I really have that consciousness now. Like when I go to the gym, I'm like training balance. I'm training to like, if I fall, I don't want to break a hip. I'm not training to get, like beautiful Michelle Obama shoulders as much anymore. So I think there's some element of that. Like, be careful because if you feel influenced, you probably are. And then consider how that might affect your long term health.
Yes. 100%.
Carnivore, we did it. Virtual high five. Oh. Okay, so next up, I mean, this actually, carnivore doesn't grind my gears as much as continuous glucose monitors do. I have like a special
You do.
burr in my heart. Um, and that is coming up next. So stay
Yes.
tuned for that episode.
So excited.
I'll see you then, Hannah.
All right. Bye.
Bye.